Captain America is back in Avengers Twilight issue number 2, but my question is he actually back? Is the Star-Spangled Hero what he once was, or is he little more than just a puppet? So Avengers Twilight issue number 1 unfolded in an alternate reality where the public, after enduring the oppressive rule of an authoritarian government, begins to yearn for the return of unregulated heroism. Now, this narrative diverges from the typical superhero storyline by imagining a future where Steve Rogers, having been depowered by the removal of the super soldier serum, leads a humble life far removed from his days as Captain America. Despite living quietly with his wife and occasionally meeting old friends, Rogers is disturbed by the increasing loss of freedoms and the manipulation of public perception by a government corporate media alliance. So this story is set in a dystopian society where it's very prosperous, but it's also marred by authoritarian practices like curfews and surveillance under the quote-unquote Watcher Act. This setting merges the oppressive surveillance state of George Orwell's 1984 with the passive compliance found in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And Rogers' reflection on his inability to change the political landscape through a Senate run, as well as the public's acceptance of a falsified narrative about Red Skull, illustrates the deep-seated issues with this society. The turning point in issue number 1 comes when Rogers, after witnessing some of the consequences of the authoritarian rule and provoked by the public denunciation from James Stark, who is the son of Tony Stark and Janet Van Dyne the Wasp, as well as the death of Matt Murdock, decides to become Captain America once again. Now, Stark leads a new, oppressive version of the Avengers and blames the original team for past disasters while embodying the new face of authoritarian heroism. Rogers' decision is solidified after an encounter with the Defenders, an underground resistance group led by an aged Luke Cage, who offers him a chance to regain his powers and fight back against the regime. So now that we've caught up with issue number 1, let's dive into the story of issue 2. So Captain America's back. He's got the super soldier serum running through his blood once again. He hasn't de-aged, but he's as much of a hero as he can be. And currently, he's out on the streets, bringing people into the Defenders' hideout, bringing anyone he can, saving them from the SHIELD forces and the AmeriCops and all the others, and basically doing his best to represent the freedom that he believes in while also maintaining a more covert presence. But because of these tactics, Steve is not totally sold on the Defenders movement because he's used to being out on the battlefield, on being out in the forefront, inspiring as well as fighting. But the Defenders basically suggest to him that they need to focus on the minds of the Americans rather than being out on the battlefield. Something that wasn't suggested enough, I think, to Steve during the events of Civil War. Now, I don't know if Civil War happened in this universe. It'd be interesting to see if they ever mentioned it. But unlike the Civil War story, rather than breaking people out of prison or starting a battle in the middle of New York City, Luke Cage's plan is to pirate a radio signal during the New York New Year's Eve event so that Steve can get in front of all the American people and basically plead his case. Unfortunately for Steve, not all is going well because his wife is brought to the Defenders' hideout, and because her life has been completely upturned and she's angry at Steve for not even consulting her before deciding to become Captain America again, she decides that their marriage is over, which I guess is what he gets for not marrying Sharon Carter, which I think it would have made a lot more sense for him to end up with her. And I think she would have had a lot more to contribute to the Defenders movement, being a former SHIELD spy, than Rosa, who is just a doctor. And I also have this theory that's not really substantiated by any evidence, but given her reaction to Steve becoming Captain America again, I find it a little odd because there's no way you could be married to the man, to supposedly know him that well, and not believe that he would have returned to the role of Captain America at some point. I mean, I guess it's easy for us, the audience, to think that way, but given that she lived in a world where Steve Rogers and the Avengers existed, I just don't see how this is such a surprise. And I get she's angry about the fact that he didn't consult her, he just did it. But still, I think it's a very abrupt reaction, and I wonder if it's possible that Rosa is actually a plant or a spy, that she was placed in Steve's life by the overarching villain of the story, which I will get to towards the end, and basically, kind of keeping him in line, as in issue 1, she was very dismissive about Luke Cage's and Matt Murdock's suggestion to Steve that he take on the mantle of Cap again, basically kind of trying to keep him at home, keep him doing what he was doing at the time, which was just volunteering at soup kitchens. So I wonder if she was a plant to keep Steve Rogers out of the hero game, and now that she's here, she could be a spy and, report on the Defenders' movements. But moving on, in the public eye, the manufactured official Avengers are the ones who have everyone's attention. It's on TV, it's what everyone's talking about. Though on the street level, there is, for example, a waitress wearing an apron with a Hawkeye symbol, which is interesting, talking about how she believes that Cap has returned. Though at this point, he's still a bit of an urban legend, somewhat like the Bruce Wayne in The Dark Knight Returns. Though unfortunately, it's not just the citizens whispering about Cap's return, because it's gone all the way up to the presidential level, and it turns out that this president is actually controlled by James Stark, and it seems even more so by Kyle Jarvis, the brother of the former butler of Tony Stark in the Avengers. And this is definitely a more overt admission of the corporations controlling the government and the media as well, which is something I mentioned in the review of issue 1. And basically their plan to deal with Rogers is to send out the Thunderbolts rather than the Avengers, because the Avengers are their kind of like official squeaky clean team, and they don't want their Captain America to be seen beating the crap out of an old Captain America. And the Thunderbolts are, like in many universes, the government's strike force. Although we'll find out that the Thunderbolts in this universe are not powered. They're basically a team of regular humans. In fact, I believe they're a squad of Marines. And for those of you who don't know, the Thunderbolts are basically Marvel's version of Suicide Squad. They're typically supervillains or vigilantes who are, imprisoned and given a chance to kind of fight on behalf of the government as a form of parole or something like that. Now, we're introduced to two members of the Thunderbolts, and of course, they're both very butch-looking women with the sides of their heads shaved, because that seems to be the only female character design that people can come up with these days. Now, I don't know what the redhead's name is, but the other one is named Ramona Jones, and she has the nickname Bullseye. The only character whose last name would be Jones that I can think of is Rick Jones, friend of the Hulk. But again, I find it hard to believe that this would have been how his kid turned out. Though it's interesting because the redhead is kind of apprehensive about going after Steve Rogers. She mentions that her dad served because of Captain America and his legend. Whereas Ramona is the one who's all about duty. She says, if the mission is to take down Cap, then that's exactly what we're going to do. Though it's important to keep that in mind because the dynamic will actually change. Now, while Luke Cage's defenders are prepping to take over the radio signal, Steve Rogers goes out on one last recruiting mission. Though it's odd given that he mentions that there are other heroes out there, but this is the only recruiting mission that we've seen him on. And who do you think survived all these years later and is fit for action? Someone like Wolverine, Thor, the Sentry, really strong characters that also don't age? Nope, it's Kamala Khan, who according to Cap was, quote unquote, one of the best.
You serious?
It's unfortunate that we're not past the point where Marvel is done pretending like Kamala Khan is an incredibly popular character. I mean, the Marvels came out months ago. Miss Marvel came out a couple years ago. The Miss Marvel's Death comic came out a while ago, and it's not like anybody believed she would actually stay dead. Though the idea that Spider-Man and Captain America and the Thing would be crying over her body, over this kid that they barely know, is hilarious. And she's not a bad character, but I think the sales numbers for her comics say that she's not a popular character. And Marvel needs to stop artificially raising her profile, because all it does is make the character seem annoying even if she actually isn't. But Kamala Khan turns Steve down. She has 2 kids, and she's a mom, so she's kind of content to stick her head in the sand, much like Cap was in issue 1. Though it will turn out that not only does she listen to the Defender's secret radio channel, but that she has actually used her powers to help some people out in public, enough so that people would notice, at least the Defenders, and Steve Rogers would find out. So on New Year's Eve, Cap and the Defenders go out in public. They take down some of the cops, they hack into the radio signals, and Cap unmasks himself in front of the crowd, gets a microphone, and basically pleads his case to the American people, rather than in, Civil War, where he was trying to tell people that, at the time he was fighting for the ability for citizens to maintain their secret identity if they were a vigilante of any sort, believing that it would not only protect their freedom, but also their loved ones. Whereas in this case, he's kind of doing a more broad appeal to humanity and to Americans, and basically telling them straight up hey, your government is taking away your freedom. The Watcher Act isn't there to help you, and we need to look out for each other. It's a more generalized, more simple message, and yet it seems to fall completely on deaf ears. Though that isn't before the Thunderbolts try to assassinate Steve. Remember, I mentioned that the dynamic between these two Thunderbolts characters would change. So now the redheaded chick is the one who's gunning after Cap, while Ramona, who has her sights on Captain America's head and has the chance to kill him, instead shoots the device out of his hand. So she kind of does her duty, but also doesn't kill Steve Rogers. Which again begs the question, who is Ramona? What is her family ties to superheroism or supervillainy, if there is any, and what part is she going to play moving forward? Back at the Defenders' hideout, Steve is incredibly sad and downtrodden, as are the other Defenders, because basically the Defenders are scanning the different frequencies out there, and they're finding out that people either have no opinion of what Steve Rogers said to the American people, or they disagree with him. And he says, I thought I could just tell people what's happening and they'd believe me. Join the fight. I thought that their freedoms meant something to them. I thought that the flag that I wear meant something to people. Which is an odd thing to say, because given what we saw of Steve in issue 1, we know that he tried to run for Senate and the people denied him. That and the fact that everyone was seemingly, fairly positive about the environment that they lived in, that they voted for all this, that they were content with the way things were. It's also funny that he says, I thought I could just tell people what's happening and they believe me. That was a criticism I had of issue number 1, applying to Chip Zdarsky's writing, is that he spent too much time telling us, the audience, what was going on rather than showing us. And so it's funny that he mentions that. And so I guess maybe I was wrong and that was actually, he did that on purpose. I guess we'll find out going forward. But Luke Cage doesn't allow Steve to basically wallow in self-pity. Though it's odd what he says to him, because he says, we don't have time for your sad American dream speeches. Which I think is definitely inconsistent, because that's literally what he had Cap sign up for. In issue 1, he told Cap, I want you to be an icon. I want you to be a public face. You need to, the Defenders are in the dark. We're underground, trying to save people as we can. But we need somebody to go out there and represent heroism, to represent hope. And so this idea that Steve Rogers did what he always does, what people respect him for, it didn't work, and now Luke Cage seems to be singing a different tune. So I don't know if that's just an inconsistent writing on Chip Zdarsky's part, or if Luke Cage is just really eager to drop any project that leads to failure right away. And so their next goal is to recruit Tony Stark. Now, I don't know if they mean that literally, like if Tony Stark is, I don't know if Tony Stark is technically alive, or if they're going to do what James Stark did and simply tap into his mind for ideas, which would still be helpful, but it'd also be kind of interesting if Tony Stark was alive. They could bring him back to a sense of consciousness and, sort of be a part of the Avengers. I mean, in the 616 universe, they had an AI Tony Stark for a while, so I don't see why, Tony Stark as a head couldn't be attached to an Iron Man suit and be an Avenger once again. But that isn't the end of the story. There's another side with the villains. Specifically, Kyle Jarvis is trying to convince James Stark to become Iron Man, to not just make the suits for the army and for the government, but to actually put on the armor in order to stop Steve Rogers. Now, James is completely against the idea. He doesn't want to be a part of any of this, and Kyle tells him, he says, Iron Man is your destiny, James. Tony Stark and Janet Van Dyne didn't sire a fool, and I didn't raise a coward. Which is interesting, because I think it implies that Tony and Jan must have died very soon after James was born, and so he was raised almost completely by Kyle Jarvis. Now, again, I don't know if Tony Stark is technically dead, but obviously he was in no place to raise James Stark, although it is odd, because that would mean that Kyle Jarvis was the one who basically kept Tony Stark's head alive, and at some point had to have revealed that to James, and James was seemingly okay with it. So it seems obvious that Kyle Jarvis is the one pulling the strings here. And it turns out that he is in fact the Red Skull, that in the aftermath of Hero Day, he found an Ultron head, and using Ultron's AI, which he's trapped, they've worked together to slowly take control of the country and possibly the world, which is what the Red Skull always does. This isn't the first time that he's taken over someone's body by implanting his consciousness or cloning someone or anything like that. And now we know why that Red Skull documentary was allowed to exist, is because he likely made the documentary and had James Stark push it in the media. So obviously he's trying to fix his image in the eyes of the American people. I assume he's going to reveal himself as the Red Skull at some point and say, hey, this world of prosperity you live in is my doing. And the weird part is that he tells Ultron that once he completes his game and he's shaped the world, that Ultron can take it over. But I have to believe that he's lying to him, because what would be the point in shaping the world the way he wants it if Ultron is just going to replace humanity with robots afterwards? It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And you have to remember that the Red Skull seems to have the upper hand over Ultron here, so it's possible he could just turn Ultron off at any time. But we'll have to wait to see how that works out. Anyways, this was a fairly interesting issue. It was a little bit better than issue 1, and as I mentioned, it seemed to sort of answer / fix some of the criticisms I had with issue 1, though I still think it could be better, because as I said, I think the Luke Cage's reaction to Steve Rogers was kind of odd, as well as Steve Rogers' reaction to the people, given what we saw in issue 1. But other than that, it was a pretty good comic. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you would hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell so that you never miss out on a new video. Thanks for watching.